"In my empire, the sun never sets." These words, spoken with pride by Philip II, were not just a poetic metaphor, they were a fact. At the height of his reign, the Spanish Empire stretched so vast that, while the sun was setting over the American colonies, it was already rising over the Philippines, named in his honor. He was the most powerful man on the planet, the direct heir to the throne of Charles V, the emperor who had ruled half of Europe. Philip grew up under the shadow of greatness, molded to be not merely a king but an almost divine figure, the arm of God on earth. Discipline and faith guided his every step, and his life revolved around one sacred duty: to keep united an empire where languages, cultures, and beliefs merged under a single authority, his own. Yet behind the imposing facade and the serene gaze of the prudent king, there was a deeply lonely man. Philip II rarely smiled, avoided public displays of affection, and lived buried in documents, decrees, and prayers. He believed that ruling was an act of penance, not pleasure. His days were long, silent, and meticulously ordered within the austere walls of El Escorial, the palace monastery he built as a symbol of faith, power, and eternity. But this pursuit of perfection and absolute control turned him into a prisoner of his own conscience. Every decision, every signature, every sentence was weighed under his belief that nothing happened without divine will. This made him fear his own mistakes, a fear that followed him like a constant shadow, feeding the rigidity and distrust that would define his final years. Still, Philip believed himself to be the chosen one, the guardian of the Catholic faith against the Protestant advance. He was the one who sent the invincible Armada to subdue Elizabeth I's England, an act of arrogance and religious zeal that ended in disaster. And ironically, while he tried to control the fate of the world, something silent and invisible was already taking over his body, a force no human power could stop. The king who once ruled oceans and continents would soon be defeated by his most intimate and cruel enemy, his own decaying flesh. And it's here that our story begins to descend into the shadows of power and human frailty. Before we continue to the next part of this journey, where you'll discover how glory turned into suffering and how the most feared man on earth was reduced to the most painful of existences, I have an important request for you. If this story has captured your attention so far, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. It's not just a symbolic gesture, it's vital for the channel's growth. YouTube understands that the video is relevant when you engage with it. And that's what allows stories like this to reach more people who also love exploring the hidden corners of history. So, if you want to keep uncovering the secrets and tragedies behind the great names of the past, your subscription is the fuel that keeps this work alive. Now tell me in the comments, what has surprised you the most about Philip II's life so far? Was it the size of his empire, the loneliness behind the crown, or the irony of a man who ruled the world but not himself? Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation about the king who was devoured alive will leave you completely speechless. Great empires are not built only with swords and crowns, but also with stories of love, pain, and solitude. And few kings ever felt this as deeply as Philip II of Spain. Behind the golden armor of the ruler who commanded half the world, there was a man scarred by a series of losses that shaped both his heart and his destiny. Philip II was married 4 times, and each of those unions left him with a wound that never truly healed. His first love was Maria of Portugal, a young woman of serene beauty and gentle soul. They married amid political expectations, but, surprisingly, there was genuine affection between them. Maria brought to the monarch something he would never feel again, the sensation of being loved without interest or ambition. However, happiness was brief. During the birth of their son, Don Carlos, Maria died. Philip was devastated. The joy of fatherhood was immediately swallowed by guilt and grief. In the years that followed, he rarely mentioned her name, but secretly kept portraits and relics, as if still hoping that her feminine presence might guide him through the shadows of his throne. The surviving child, Don Carlos, would later become his greatest tragedy, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for love. The second marriage, to Mary Tudor, the dreaded Queen of England, was a carefully crafted alliance. Philip saw in her the chance to unite 2 great Catholic powers and restore the Roman faith in Protestant England. Yet, The relationship was distant and formal. Mary was an older woman, marked by loneliness and religious obsession. Philip, on the other hand, viewed their union more as a political duty than an emotional bond. The English despised him, calling him the arrogant foreigner, and fearing that England would become merely another extension of the Spanish crown. When Mary died without leaving an heir, Philip lost not only the opportunity to consolidate an even greater empire, but also the last trace of warmth that remained in his hardened heart. The third marriage, to Elizabeth of Valois, Princess of France, was the most unexpected. Elizabeth was young, graceful, and full of life, a striking contrast to the aging, melancholy king. And for the first time in years, Philip smiled. They laughed together, exchanged gifts, and seemed genuinely close. The king, who had once seen love as a distraction, began to believe that perhaps there was still room for happiness, even in the midst of empire. But joy was once again short-lived. Elizabeth died at the age of 23 due to complications in childbirth, and Philip fell into a near-sepulchral silence. Her death destroyed him emotionally, turning him into an even more withdrawn and devout man. Some accounts say he would secretly visit her former chambers, praying alone for hours, surrounded by memories and regret. The fourth and final marriage, to Anna of Austria, was the coldest of all. Philip no longer sought love, only stability and heirs. Anna was obedient and discreet, and although she bore him children, she never managed to breach the emotional walls surrounding the king. He had surrendered to solitude. Each loss made him more rigid, more introspective, more detached from common humanity. Within the corridors of El Escorial, the monumental palace he himself had ordered to be built, Philip came to live almost like a monk. He slept little, prayed much, and trusted no one. The man who had once dreamed of uniting Christendom now wandered alone through a labyrinth of cold stone, surrounded only by echoes and memories. And it is precisely here that the story begins to shift in tone. For while the king sought refuge in faith and silence, something deeper and darker began to corrode not only his soul, but also his body. A punishment that neither crown, nor gold, nor prayer could stop. It is within this atmosphere of solitude and remorse that the next chapter of our story is born. The ghost of Prince Carlos, the son who became a curse. Among all the sorrows Philip II carried throughout his life, none was as heavy or as dark as his relationship with his own son, Prince Don Carlos. From an early age, the heir to the throne showed signs of instability. He was impulsive, arrogant, and unpredictable, as if a storm raged within him. It is said that he suffered a serious fall as a child, striking his head and lingering for days between life and death. After that, his behavior became erratic, sudden fits of anger, drastic mood swings, and actions that terrified the royal court. He insulted nobles, threatened servants, and at times seemed to despise his own father. Philip, in turn, saw it all as a divine burden, a trial sent by God to test his faith. He tried to draw closer to his son, but there was an abyss between them that even blood could not bridge. Don Carlos detested his father's discipline and coldness, while Philip could not bear his son's chaos and disobedience. In public, the prince even threatened the king, declaring that once he took the throne, he would avenge himself on all who had opposed him. Whispers began to circulate at court that the prince planned to flee and ally himself with Spain's enemies. For a monarch who believed every act had divine meaning, the idea of a rebellious son was more than a family tragedy. It was a threat to the state itself. One night in 1568, without warning, Philip ordered the arrest of his own son. Don Carlos was taken to a windowless room with thick walls, guarded day and night by trusted men. No friends were allowed to visit him. No confessor was sent. Silence reigned. Days later, the prince was dead. The official statement claimed that his frail health had worsened and that he had died naturally. But no one believed it. In the corridors of power, foreign ambassadors whispered that Philip had ordered his son's death to protect the throne. Some said Don Carlos had been poisoned. Others believed he had died of starvation or despair. The truth vanished with him inside that dark cell. The king never offered explanations. He merely ordered masses and withdrew into prayer. Yet the episode shattered his image as a just and pious ruler. Europe began to see him as a cold, merciless man, one willing to sacrifice even his own blood for the sake of political order. To Protestants, it was divine punishment for the king's fanaticism. To Catholics, a mystery best left unspoken. Philip withdrew further into himself, sinking into a spiritual solitude that would follow him to his death. For decades, he avoided mentioning his son's name. He had Don Carlos's portraits removed from the palace walls and forbade any public discussion of the matter. But inside him, guilt and remorse remained alive, quietly consuming him. Centuries later, historians discovered a handwritten letter by the king, hidden among confessional notes and private prayers. In it, Philip revealed the torment within his heart. "My son was my punishment. My heart is buried with him, but my soul has not yet been forgiven." These words unveil not the mighty king, but the broken father, the man who bore the heaviest crown on earth, yet failed to protect his own heir. The ghost of Don Carlos never left him. It is said that on cold nights at El Escorial, Philip would wander the corridors alone, murmuring his son's name and begging for forgiveness. Servants claimed to hear footsteps and voices in the old prince's chamber, as if guilt itself had taken form. The episode scarred not only his conscience, it marked the beginning of his spiritual and physical decay. From that moment on, the king's health began to fail, and the empire he had fought so hard to preserve weakened along with him. The man who once believed he could control everything was now haunted by the one thing he could not command: remorse. And it was in this atmosphere of guilt and isolation that Philip sank deeper into his faith, turning devotion into imprisonment and his palace into a monastery. For as he sought reconciliation with God, a new and far crueler battle was beginning within himself. And thus, our story moves to its next chapter, the faith that became a prison. Faith was always the center of Philip II's life. From a young age, he believed he had been chosen by God to protect Catholicism and eradicate everything he deemed heresy. This conviction shaped him as both man and king. In the eyes of the world, he was the defender of the faith, a pious, austere monarch determined to preserve the spiritual purity of Christendom. But within himself, that devotion slowly turned into an invisible prison, one that not even the towering walls of El Escorial could contain. Philip saw religion not merely as a moral guide, but as a weapon. Under this divine pretext, he strengthened the Inquisition, persecuting heretics, converted Jews, and anyone who dared question the authority of the Church. Under his rule, fear became as powerful as faith. Thousands were tortured and executed in the name of a salvation few truly understood. To him, each condemned soul was a spiritual victory, a way to please God. Yet with every sentence passed, an invisible weight pressed harder upon his conscience. Over time, Philip's unshakable faith transformed into obsession. He came to believe that every defeat, every illness was a sign of divine displeasure. When he decided to confront Protestant England under Elizabeth I, he saw it as fulfilling a sacred mission. Thus was born the famous Invincible Armada, a colossal fleet of Spanish ships sent to subdue the English and restore the authority of the Catholic Church. It was the greatest display of power the world had ever seen, and it would become the greatest failure of his reign. The fleet was devastated by storms and English cannon fire. Thousands of sailors perished without ever setting foot on enemy soil. The defeat was so absolute that even the most faithful began to wonder whether God still favored Spain. Philip received the news in silence and prayer, but those close to him described a broken man. One court chronicler recorded a sentence that still echoes like a cry of clarity amid the shadows. "Perhaps God punishes me for having confused faith with power." It was the first time he admitted doubt, and that doubt grew like an invisible wound. After the fall of the Armada, Philip withdrew even further into isolation. He spent long hours in the oratory of El Escorial, kneeling before the crucifix, praying in a whisper. He knelt until his knees ached, fasted frequently, and believed that physical suffering could purify his sins. The man who once ruled kings and empires now wrestled with spiritual ghosts. Everything around him became a reflection of guilt. The lost wars, the enemies who prospered, even the illnesses that began to ravage his body. Gout, constant fevers, inflammation, and profound fatigue accompanied him to the end. To many, these were merely the ailments of an exhausted life. But to Philip, they were unmistakable signs of divine wrath. He saw each pain as a reminder that the crown did not make him immune to God's judgment. The more he prayed, the more he became convinced that his soul was being tested. Some days he was seized by an almost mystical fervor. On others, he sank into dark silences, certain that he had been abandoned by the very creator he had served. The corridors of El Escorial, once symbols of glory and faith, turned into cloisters of penance. Inside, Philip lived like a monk, without luxury, without smiles, surrounded only by candles, crucifixes, and the distant chants of monks. Everything about him breathed resignation and remorse. The man who once believed he governed the destiny of Christendom now saw himself as a prisoner of his own devotion. And as he drowned in the shadows of faith, his body began to betray his spirit. The joint pain worsened, the exhaustion deepened, and burning fevers drove him to delirium. Some said it was divine punishment, others that it was simply the toll of a life consumed by power. But the king had no doubts. He believed that God had abandoned him so that he might atone in life for the sins of all Spain. Little did he know that the true judgment was about to begin, not in heaven, but within his very flesh. For the faith that once guided him would now become the stage of his most excruciating torment. And it is from this moment that we descend into the next harrowing chapter of this story. The body that rebelled, devoured alive. The summer of 1598 was the cruelest Spain had ever seen, and within the stone walls of El Escorial, the palace meant to symbolize God's glory on earth, a king was being slowly consumed by his own body. Philip II, the most powerful man on the planet, lay in his bed surrounded by sheets soaked in sweat and blood, fighting a pain that no army could ever conquer. The wounds began as small inflammations, but within days turned into open abysses oozing pus and dark matter. The royal physicians, bound by the limited medical knowledge of their time, applied herbal poultices, mercury ointments, and performed bloodlettings in hopes of balancing the body's humours. None of it worked. With every new treatment, the infection spread further, as if the king's own body had declared war against him. The stench was unbearable. Neither incense, nor flowers, nor perfumes could mask the smell of rotting flesh. It is said that even the monks, men accustomed to suffering and death, had to stifle their nausea before entering the royal chamber. The hot, humid air of the Spanish summer turned the room into a funereal oven. And amid this grotesque scene came the most merciless invaders of all, lice and maggots. Servants, wearing gloves and cloths, would remove handfuls of insects from the king's sores, only for them to return hours later, drawn by the dead flesh and heat. It was an endless cycle of cleaning and reinfestation. Some accounts describe the monarch's body as a battlefield where life and decay had become indistinguishable. And yet, through it all, Philip's mind remained lucid. He continued to pray, dictated orders, reviewed documents, and demanded that masses be held daily beside his bed. He insisted he could not despair, for he was still king, even if his throne was now no more than his deathbed. Those who had the courage to stay by his side recounted that, amid groans of agony, he still spoke of faith and duty. At one moment, when a servant wept upon seeing him in such a state, Philip murmured with serene resignation, "God made me king over men, but not over worms." That sentence, recorded by witnesses, summarized the tragic irony of his existence. The man who once commanded armies and oceans now could not command the rot spreading through his own flesh. The infections deepened into wounds so severe that the bone was exposed. Maggots nested there, feeding on what was left of the king. Every attempt to move him brought screams that echoed through the corridors of El Escorial. Still, he refused to surrender to weakness. He chose to suffer in silence, believing that his pain was the price for his sins, that God was purifying him through it. The suffering lasted 52 long days. During that time, the empire came to a halt. Urgent matters of state were handled by his counselors, but no one dared disturb the dying king. Philip II, ever disciplined, continued to receive reports and sign decrees, his trembling, ulcered hands struggling to hold the quill. His faith kept him conscious, and until the very end he believed his body was being tested like gold in divine fire. As September drew near, the heat became unbearable, and death could be felt in every labored breath. His face had turned pale, his eyes sunken, his body swollen with infection. His heartbeat weakened, yet he still found the strength to clutch a crucifix and whisper prayers. When September 13, 1598 finally arrived, Philip asked that the crucifix be placed upon his chest, and before his children and the attending monks, he closed his eyes for the last time. He died at 71, conscious, exhausted, and surrounded by insects. The man who had ruled half the world, who believed he was chosen by God to guide it, was devoured by his own flesh, inch by inch, until nothing remained but silence. And perhaps within that silence lies the most bitter lesson of all. Power may conquer the world, but it can never defeat nature. The king who dreamed of eternity discovered that the body is the frailest of prisons, and that not even the most devout of men can escape the fate shared by all. Yet, even in death, Philip II would continue to shape the course of history, for what followed his passing marked the dawn of a new era, the decline of an empire, and the transformation of a legend into a warning. And that is what we shall explore next in the following chapter: legacy, decline, and the final irony. When Philip II finally departed this world, the empire he had built with such zeal and rigidity began to crumble, little by little. The throne passed to his son, Philip III, a man of gentle temperament, lacking his father's vigour. He did not inherit the political intelligence nor the moral strength that had sustained Spain for decades. Under his rule, the empire once called the realm where the sun never sets began to sink into a slow and inevitable decline. The colonies, once endless sources of gold and power, became heavy burdens. Wars, excessive spending, and corruption ate away at the heart of the empire. Gradually, Spain's golden brilliance gave way to the shadows of decay. It was as if the dead king's body had left a living curse upon his kingdom. The same process of rot that had destroyed him now seemed to consume his legacy. The spirit of the old monarch still lingered over El Escorial, the colossal monastery he had built as a symbol of faith and eternity. Today, centuries later, visitors still walk through its cold and silent corridors, gazing at the portraits, the altars, and the chamber where Philip spent his final days. The guides speak of his devotion, his power, and his historical importance, but rarely of the stench of decomposing flesh that once filled that same air. They do not mention the larvae, the muffled cries, the loneliness, or the cruel irony of a king who believed he had conquered the world, but was ultimately defeated by his own flesh. El Escorial still stands, firm, like a monument of stone to an empire that once believed itself eternal, but its creator lies within, a prisoner of his own ambitions. The man who dreamed of eternity became immortal not through greatness, but through decay. The king who built a palace to glorify faith and power is now remembered as the king who rotted alive, devoured by worms before his soul could find rest. And perhaps that is the bitterest irony of all. Philip built El Escorial to defy time, but time defeated him. His story, meant to be sung in hymns of glory, now echoes as a warning about the limits of human sovereignty. In the end, it does not matter how many territories one rules, how many armies one commands, or how many altars one raises. We are all equal before nature and death. The crown, the gold, the throne, all fade away. What remains is only who we truly were, once power dissolves. Philip II believed God had made him king to govern men, but he learned in the harshest way possible that no one governs mortality. Nature, cold and silent, was his final judge, and her verdict was merciless. Today, history remembers him as the king who conquered the world yet lost himself. The man who thought he ruled the destiny of others but could not control his own suffering. And in the end, it was nature itself that stole his crown. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this intense and haunting journey through the fate of the king who believed he was eternal. Now tell me in the comments, what struck you the most in this story? Was it how power isolated him, the suffering he endured, or the irony of being remembered more for his death than for his glory? I'd truly love to hear your thoughts, because every perspective on this tale reveals a new meaning. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps YouTube share this story with more people and keeps alive the mission of telling the tales time tried to erase. And before you go, don't leave just yet. The video now appearing on your screen is even more fascinating, full of twists, mystery, and emotion. I promise, it's even more captivating and powerful than this one. So click now and continue with me on this journey into the deepest and most human side of history.